and we'll get started right away. And just for folks, I know folks may have seen in terms of, if you have an AI chatbot that we may have declined, which we typically do, we're going to share these slides and we'll also share this recording with folks afterwards, and we'll be available. So I want to make sure this continues to be a resource for all of you folks. But welcome all to I think this is now our 5th open house. It's at least 4th, I can tell you that. And this is an opportunity to quickly kind of intro you to MTF for those who are not familiar with us, but hopefully more importantly showcase some of our work as it relates to Governor Healey's fiscal year 2027 budget, which was just put out on Wednesday of this week. And so there is a lot in the budget I want to make sure we get to, whatever questions folks have, things like that. And so I will start just very briefly with a little bit about MTF, who we are. So we are a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit research organization, and we focus on a variety of public policy issues that relate to the long-term sustainable and equitable economic growth of the Commonwealth. As part of that, a big part of what we do is looking at public finance issues, but also public policy issues that cover the gamut of things that really affect that long-term future of the Commonwealth. And that's what we are focused on. In recent years, we've done a lot more on demographic work. We do this competitiveness index. We work on federal impact work. But really, it's all rounded in how public policy relates to the future of the Commonwealth. And I really want to take a moment to just highlight the fantastic team we have here at MTF. We're pretty small, just 8 folks. As you can see here with Andy, Deb, Megan, Pablo, Victoria, April, and Phil, we have a team that covers a wide array of policy areas, from the state budget to early education to workforce to transportation. And we also work hard to engage with our members, with our philanthropic supporters, to bring in new staff and fellowship positions like April's, which is the Policy Start Fellowship. Phil Lynch recently started as our mid-career fellow. We're always looking to kind of expand our research capacity and doing it in a way that's hopefully helping to create a pipeline of current and future public policy professionals. And as I get into this work today, everyone on the MTF team certainly contributes to all of what we do, whether it's the events or our research, and specifically our budget work. But Megan Callahan, our research director, is really the quarterback of all of our budget work. Basically, every slide you're about to see, Megan put together with assistance from other staff folks. Megan would normally be co-presenting this with me, but she's a little under the weather, so you're stuck with me. But really appreciative of the fantastic team we have here. And then just to give you a sense of what we do a lot with research and publications, right? So as I mentioned before, our work really keeps as its foundation public finance, so state budget, tax policy, but that relates to so much of what happens here in Massachusetts that means that we do a lot of work with demographics and childcare and K-12 education, healthcare, workforce and economic development, housing, transportation, federal impacts. These are all areas that we've published, in many cases, multiple reports over the last year. And we work really hard to stay engaged and stay active in areas that our membership and the larger civic community care about. And this just gives you a sense. Over the last year, we've really increased our focus thanks to some generous philanthropic support related to impacts of changing federal policies on Massachusetts. And so this is just a selection of some of the press coverage we've gotten on how our work there, we think, has hopefully shaped the public dialogue and informed our members and the broader public on those issues as well. And then the final thing I'll say is a little bit of a commercial for MTF before I get started on the substance. We do a number of events, whether it's virtual events like this, which we do every month for our members. So we did a similar briefing for all of our members on the governor's budget yesterday. But we also work really hard to do in-person events to help our members meet each other, meet policymakers, and engage in substantive policy conversations. So if you want to learn more about MTF, who we are, what we do, how you can support our incredibly important work, please reach out to me, reach out to Debbie Carroll, our membership director. We'll share our contact information after this. And again, just thank you so much for joining here today. And with that, I'm going to kick off the kind of substance of what we're going to talk about, which is Governor Healey's fiscal year 2027 budget proposal, which came out on Wednesday. And what I would say is we want this presentation to be as helpful for all of you as possible. So if you have questions, you can either raise your hand and we'll call on folks. We'll also try to leave some time at the end for questions. You can also put questions in the chat. If you put questions in the chat, those will get back to you afterwards, okay? So we'll follow up via email and make sure we'll get back to you. We'll take note of everything in the chat to follow up. But if you want to ask a question during the conversation, which we would encourage, just raise your hand and myself or someone from the team will call on you and happy to, whether it's answer a question or if you want to ask for some greater clarification, always happy to do that. So with that, let me get started. And apologies in advance that I talk somewhat quickly normally, and this is about my fourth cup of coffee this morning, so maybe even more quickly than normal. And there's a lot of ground to cover, but we'll get started now. And we start with kind of setting the stage. So as you think about Governor Healey's budget proposal, when you think about the other budget proposals we will see in the coming months, one of the frameworks that we would suggest that folks use is this kind of twofold issue matrix that we're seeing, right? So on the one hand, we are seeing huge uncertainty and impacts from federal policy actions directly on Massachusetts and the kind of larger economic uncertainty related to federal policies, other things. That is absolutely kind of an environmental reality that you're going to hear me talk about, that's going to be talked about. If you saw Governor Healey talk about her budget, that was like the #1 thing she talked about. But the other kind of element we want to make sure folks understand is this longer standing public finance reality in the state budget, which is this. After a very strong kind of revenue performance during the pandemic, state spending and revenue have really gotten a little misaligned in recent years, where rates of spending growth have outpaced revenue growth. That gap, which we've been able to really manage through without drawing down stabilization fund, which is the state's rainy day fund, our ability to continue that gap, you know, the music stops on that at a certain point, right? We're not going to be able to bridge that gap. And so that was a reality that we were facing irrespective of what the feds were doing. And what that gap has meant is that the state budget, for going back a few years, has increasingly relied on some more one-time and volatile revenue sources to kind of bridge ongoing spending and ongoing revenue. That means that we're a little exposed for an economic downturn, which always is going to wreak havoc on a state budget. But I think our risk exposure is a little heightened because we've been kind of doing everything we can to keep the budget moving with spending that's slightly elevated over long-term revenue. So that's that long-term reality you're seeing that goes back probably 4 or 5 years. And then on top of that, we add this federal kind of context that is not new. What the feds do always impacts us a ton, but clearly the changes we're seeing, the disruption we're seeing, the federal walk back from kind of long-standing state federal partnerships, that's this added to the mix that kind of creates this greater tension that we're seeing in this year's budget. Okay. So just to walk folks through what that looks like. So this just shows you a couple ways to look at year-over-year non-surtax. So the surtax is the millionaire's tax, revenue growth here in Massachusetts. And what you see is revenue growth is jagged, right? It goes up, it goes down. We've got years where we've seen this huge spikes in revenue growth. We've seen 3 years of the last 6 where we've seen negative revenue growth, right? So we see a really bumpy revenue ride. When you meld that together to come up with some average rates of growth, it all depends on your time horizon, but you get long-term rates of growth probably in the 3.5% to 4% range. The last few years, it's been lower than that. You use a longer time horizon, it's slightly larger than that. But basically, that 4.5% rate of growth you see between 2015 and 2019, that's probably a slightly high-end but okay proxy for long-term revenue. But what we see on the spending side here, really going back to fiscal year 2021, are annual rates of budget spending growth of 7%, 9%, 7%, 6%. And the compounding impact of those elevated rates of spending has meant that we've got a budget that probably has kind of put on a little extra weight compared to what can be borne by ongoing revenues. That's what creates that ongoing tension. And you can manage a few years of spending that grows at 5.6% and revenues that grow at 4%, but you can't do it forever, right? And certainly if years where revenues growing at 2% and spending that's growing at 7%, that really can't last very long at all before you start doing some fiscal things that you'd really rather not want to do, either on the cut side or the revenue side, to bridge that gap. So that's that longer term issue I mentioned. And what we see in the budget is this increasing reliance on one-time resources and what we would call more volatile revenue sources. So very quickly on that, so a one-time resource, it's like taking money from your savings account to pay your rent or your mortgage, right? Once you take that money out of the savings account, it's gone. It doesn't automatically replenish. And those are the types of things we've been doing. Now, I want to be clear. Every budget involves some level of one-time resources. Random stuff happens. That's not that uncommon. And even the share of the state budget that has been comprised of one-time resources in recent years isn't particularly out of the historic norm. I think the bigger concern is we have seen the nominal amount of one-time resources increasing somewhat dramatically, right? So it was $1 billion in 25, $1.5 billion in 26, right? That's a 50% increase. That change is really more the cause of concern, especially when you're in a time where the economy and revenues are still growing, right? We're not in the middle of a recession. And so that increasing use of one-timers is a little bit of an alarm bell. The other thing to note, and on the right side of the slide, we show surtax resources. We have, in the short amount of time the millionaire's tax or the surtax has been around, I think the state put in place some really strong protections initially to limit the amount of surtax being used in the operating budget. One, to make sure we have resources available to use surtax resources for capital and infrastructure spending and education and transportation, but also to insulate the budget a little bit from volatility in the surtax. Well, last year's budget got away from that. We started to budget more and more of the surtax in the operating budget. And what we saw in last year's budget, what we see again in the governor's proposal, is effectively budgeting on all surtaxes being plowed into the operating budget. Aside from concerns about what that means for infrastructure spending and things like that, it just increases your level of risk if surtax revenues become volatile, right? And we just don't know when there's an economic downturn, what are we likely to see in surtax revenue collection? So those are those concerns kind of in brief. And so when you put all that together, one of the things that Megan did early on in our analysis this year is to say, okay, let's take a look at some basic assumptions on the revenue side, on the spending side, and let's estimate what a preliminary budget gap might look like for this fiscal year 2027 budget that starts in July. And using some pretty reasonable assumptions, you get to a budget gap in the $3 to $3.5 billion range. And that's on about a $60 billion base. Again, that probably sounds like that's some unprecedented level of budget gap. We've seen budget gaps like that before, but it's sizable, right? And what that means is when you look at the governor's budget, when you look at the House budget, the Senate budget, the first thing they really had to do is figure out how to close that budget gap. And that's before you get to new investments or new ways to change revenues up or down, right? That just closing that gap requires a lot of fiscal work to just kind of get back to the starting point. And I think that's a theme we really see in the governor's budget. So with that, let's move on to the governor's budget. We have our highly scientific top 5 things to know. There can never be 6, can never be 4, have to be 5. So one, we talked about that spending and revenue growth distortion, right? And I think there's some positive news in the governor's budget. We see that overall spending growth rate decrease. So it's at 3.8% in her budget compared to about 5.5% in last year's budget. It still does exceed expected non-surtax revenue collections, right, which are expected to grow at 2.4%. So that gap continues to be a concern, but we do, I think, see some real work being done by the administration to get that spending growth rate number down. As I just mentioned, what we're going to talk a fair amount is what are the tools the administration used to close that $3 to $3.5 billion budget gap. There's nothing in there that's really been front page news thus far, but there are some interesting things. And really what's most interesting about it is to think about that's the first decision points that are now going to be before the House and Senate. Do they agree with those gap closing solutions? What might they not like? What might they do instead? The other thing I would note is this budget continues a trend where we're starting to see the surtax do kind of more of the heavy lifting in the budget. And when you combine the operating budget, right, which the governor filed, along with a supplemental budget the governor filed the same day, which uses surtax resources, which includes another $1.2 billion or so in surtax spending. You've got a spending plan that includes about $4 billion in surtax spending. Now, that's notable because last year we collected $3 billion in surtax, right? Now, that supplemental budget she proposed, that's spending surtax resources that we've collected in past years. So we have that money. It's available to us. So my point is not that we're going to run out of surtax money to support this $4 billion necessarily. It's to say that next year, we're not going to have $4 billion in surtax to spend because over time, you can only spend as much as you collect. You kind of get 1 or 2 years where we get to spend down some of that surtax resources we built up in the first couple of years when we were being more conservative. This is kind of the last year we can do that. And so how you use those resources really matters because they're not going to be around to that same extent in subsequent years. I do think that the administration's budget deserves a lot of credit in areas like K-12 and MBTA, right? So this budget includes the final year of implementation for the Student Opportunity Act. That's the biggest reform, not really just to the K-12 funding formula, but really to a domestic Massachusetts spending program in about 30 years, right? We increased state spending by over $2 billion and done it in a way that's targeted to low-income communities, English language learners, getting to the end of that without too much kind of disruption or things like that, I think is something that was by no means a foregone conclusion when that bill was signed into law. So doing that is important. And then also, there's been a lot of discussion in the last couple of weeks about MBTA financing. I think the administration also deserves credit for really following through on their work from last year when they put out some transportation finance recommendations. That was a group we were a part of to try to provide multi-year funding support for not just the MBTA, but other transportation agencies and do it in a way that closes operating deficits. Last year, the final budget really didn't go as far as the administration would have liked in that area. We see the administration kind of going back at it this year, which I think is a good thing. And then what we also see is healthcare spending in the governor's budget, year-over-year growth. That rate of growth is down from about 10% in last year's budget to more like 3% this year. That said, what is kind of under the hood? What are the assumptions that make up healthcare spending? That's a lot more uncertain and something that we'll be looking into much more in the coming weeks. All right, so this chart is really just kind of for your use later on. This just walks you through high-level spending and revenue, shows that by our math, the governor's budget is balanced. So I'm not going to spend much time on that. But I do want to talk a little bit about revenue and resources, then we'll get on to spending. So the budget process really starts with something called the consensus revenue process. So the consensus revenue process is a statutory procedure here in Massachusetts where the administration, the House and the Senate have to come to agreement on how much base level tax revenue they are each going to build their budget around. So they have to pick the same number. What we saw in their January agreement was them agreeing to $42.2 billion in non-surtax collections. That assumes about 2.4% growth over FY 2026. Now, what's notable here in this chart is what you see here is there are a number of experts who testify and provide revenue estimates during the consensus revenue process, at which we are one. The median growth recommendation was actually 3.5%, right? So higher. And just keep in mind when I talk about that disparity between rates of spending growth and rates of revenue growth, the revenue growth is really a number they choose. Had they chosen 3.5, they would choose a number much closer to what the governor's budget actually spent. Now, certainly it's understandable given all the economic uncertainty that House Senate leaders and the administration are a little more conservative on this number. But I think our assessment was they maybe erred a little bit too much on the side of conservatism, at least considering where things were looking like both economically and in terms of spending in the budget. So that's kind of the first thing that happened to the budget. And what you see here, in I would say black and white, but let's call it blue and light blue, is just how strange the roller coaster ride Massachusetts has been on really since the pandemic, where we saw this huge surge in tax collections that culminated in fiscal year 2022. And it took us 5 years to basically pass the level of revenue collections, non-surtax, that we collected 5 years ago. And honestly, the fact that in that time we have seen budgets that continue to grow is pretty remarkable. And we've done that without taking money from the state stabilization fund is really speaks to just how much in resources the state was able to retain over those recent years. The challenge is our ability to continue to make that math work. We're kind of running out of time on that. All right, so then to just walk through a couple of the other things that matter for that consensus revenue agreement, one of the big factors in how much revenue is available for the state budget is what the state assumes it's going to collect in capital gains resources. So capital gains income taxes are historically very volatile. And so during the Great Recession, the state put in place a procedure by which there's a threshold set on capital gains revenues, and any collections above that statutory threshold aren't available for the budget and go historically to the stabilization fund primarily. One of the big proposals in the governor's budget to help close that budget gap is to rebase that threshold, to say, you know what, we haven't really taken a new look at how that threshold is calculated in 15 years. We're going to recalculate that threshold. And oh, by the way, when we do it, it's going to give us access to about $400 million in additional assumed capital gains resources. Now, I will say, I don't think the idea of taking a new look at that revenue threshold is a bad idea at all. We haven't really gone through their math yet to figure out their analysis to make sure we think that's a sustainable number. But I don't think in and of itself, this approach to kind of taking a new look at that revenue source is not only a bad idea, I think it's probably a good idea. And so I think at least theoretically, this is a smart way to try to shave off some of that budget gap, provided that that threshold they establish is a reasonable one. And then, as I mentioned, a lot of those revenues that aren't available for the budget go into the stabilization fund. The governor's budget, which is our state's rainy day fund, folks may have heard of, the governor's budget assumes a rainy day fund deposit of about $100 million. As folks, I'm sure, are aware of, have read about, our rainy day fund really grew dramatically during the pandemic and continues to stand at record levels on a nominal basis. Our stabilization fund as a share of state spending has actually declined somewhat in recent years, right? So we haven't been growing it at the same rate, but it still remains quite strong. I know we get questions a lot about when to use the stabilization fund. And so if folks have questions on our thoughts on that, happy to take that at the end. But the governor's budget does propose increasing the stabilization fund balance by $100 million. So once you go through kind of all that analysis, all of that work, you're left with a budget that you're left with $34.1 billion in non-surtax revenues for the budget. That's only growth of about $560 million over last year. So when you think about, which is less than 1% of total spending in the budget. So once you work through all that math in the budget with consensus revenue, Secretary Gorkowitz, the House and Senate, they just aren't left with that much new non-surtax revenue with which to balance the budget. Hence, you get all those other solutions that are necessary. And then, as I mentioned, this year, the surtax estimate for collections and the amount used in the budget is going to be $2.7 billion. So we collected $3 billion last year. There's a bit of a hedge factor in the projection for this year at 2.7. And unlike in the first couple of years of the surtax, the governor's budget, and we would expect the House and the Senate are going to spend all of that in their budget. That's something that we've raised concerns about, because it does have implications for what happens on infrastructure spending and other critical uses, especially in the transportation realm. But also, it really just does heighten a little bit of that budget risk. So we talked before about that budget gap of $3.5 billion. By our math, they solve about 2.7 million of it on the kind of revenue and resource solution side. So they solve the rest then by spending less than would otherwise be expected, especially in places like Mass Health. But on the revenue solution side, this is our list of $2.7 billion. We talked about the capital gains threshold adjustment a second ago. Folks may be aware the governor filed legislation a couple of weeks ago to delay how the state conforms with recent federal tax law changes. That, combined with another tax proposal from the Healy administration filed in separate legislation, would add another $400 million to the budget. They spend down a number of trust funds that were built up during the pandemic to the tune of about $500 million. And then they identify some additional trust funds to spend down. They also have some savings assumptions about some efficiency initiatives that they're undertaking. And then they have reduced our ongoing contribution to the state's pension fund from about 9.6% a year to 4% a year. That reduction in pension contribution growth saves them about $300 million. So you add all that together and you get about $2.7 billion of solutions. So to just preview what we'll talk about at the end is kind of, when you look at this list, one thing to keep in mind is like, which of these things do we think the House and Senate are inclined to go along with, and which of these things might folks have concerns with? That's one of the fundamental questions. And then when we look at that list, we would identify a little more than half of it, so about $1.5 billion as one-time resources. Now, that's a reduction from FY 2026, which is a good thing. Slight asterisk on that. As I mentioned before, the governor's budget proposes a permanent change in how we devote capital gains resources to the budget. In recent years, we've done some one-time diversions of those capital gains revenues. So if we were to have done this chart last year, that capital gains diversion would show up as a one-timer. But because they're proposing it now as a permanent change, it doesn't. So there's a little bit of apples and oranges of this comparison to last year. But in fairness to them, when you look at true one-timers, we get about 1.45 billion, which is a slight reduction over FY 2026. All right, so I'm going to move on to spending. If anyone has any urgent revenue questions, raise your hand now. If not, we can take some of those at the end. I think I'm probably doing okay for time, but let me just pause for 1 second to grab a sip of coffee and see if folks have any urgent questions. All right, on to spending. So what this chart shows you is non-surtax nominal spending growth, okay? So just the increase or decrease in spending compared to the FY 26 GAA. What is the GAA? So that stands for the General Appropriations Act. That's basically the budget the governor signed after her veto message in July of last year, right? And so that doesn't include future supplemental spending, but in our minds, that's really the best apples to apples comparison for the governor's budget, the House budget, and the Senate budget. So what do you see here? What you see here, first and foremost, is aside from, kind of irrespective of the fact that healthcare spending as a rate of growth is down from recent years, it still dominates new spending in this budget. That's healthcare and really support services as well, which is, DMA, Department of Mental Health, Department of Developmental Services, things like that. That's far and away where most new dollars are going. Education, you see here, you would also see, obviously, we did a chart, which we have in a couple slides, on surtax spending. The reason why education is really showing up here is because, as I mentioned before, the administration is proposing spending down some education trusts, both for K-12 and early education in this year. So that's why that's showing up in what otherwise might be surtax spending. But the other thing to note here is you continue to see what has been true for a long time, which is really the cross-subsidization of healthcare spending growth with limited spending growth in every other area of the budget. Now, part of this is the mass health, other healthcare budget is so much larger than, say, energy and environmental affairs or workforce. So there is kind of a scale issue here. But it is absolutely true that in order for us to afford, $2 billion in additional spending in those top three areas, it limits what you can spend in the other areas, right? Like that's just how the math works. And when you look at the 10 line items that are growing the most in the governor's budget compared to the budget signed last year, you see a lot of healthcare, right? Number one on this list is actually a new line item the governor is proposing for human service and healthcare transportation. What they have done is they've so this is not a new initiative. What they're doing is they're taking transportation costs that we already paid for in the budget in other line items and segregating them into their own line item. And they're actually using $100 million in surtax resources to pay for that, theoretically because it's transportation costs. But so if folks see that, it's not a new initiative. It's kind of part of what we've done before. But then you see group insurance group insurance commission premiums, right? So that's health insurance premiums for public employees. And then you see mass health. You see mass senior care. You see a number of Chapter 70, which is K-12. You see sped circuit breaker. You see two child care line items on here, but that's a little misleading because there was a large supplemental appropriation through surtax resources for childcare last year. And really, once you net all that in, this year's governor's budget is basically level funding for childcare. But we just, you do the math the same way for each of them. So that's why that shows up here. So what you see here is healthcare, see education, and you really see support services. All right, so let's talk a little bit about surtax spending as well. So as I mentioned before, the governor's budget proposes $2.7 billion in surtax spending, which is the entirety of the amount assumed in FY 2027. This education transportation split, which folks may have heard about a lot, you often see that split more heavily skewed towards education in the operating budget because there's just a lot more education spending in the operating budget than there is in transportation. You see more transportation spending when we'll look in a second at the surtax supplemental budget the governor filed at the same time, which is more on infrastructure, capital spending. That's more transportation focused. But what you see here is 64% on education, 36% on transportation. The biggest place we're seeing education spending is K-12. That's Chapter 70 support, so Student Opportunity Act support. It's also universal school meals. The surtax is supporting free community college. It's supporting child care stabilization grants. Those are kind of the big ticket items that we're seeing on the education side. And then on the big initiative we're seeing on the transportation side, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, is the governor is proposing saying, okay, we're going to spend $975 million of the surtax in the operating budget on transportation, and we're going to securitize that entire amount. So we're going to pledge $975 million a year to a special transportation trust fund that we can then spend out of, but also borrow against. That's an initiative that we've been supportive of because we think it helps to, one, build in some predictability for transportation spending, and while we're addressing some operating deficits in transportation, also improve our capital capacity there. So that's the big picture on operating budget surtax spending. And again, what this surtax supplemental budget, or we call it oftentimes the innovation and capital sub, what the structure that was set up a couple years ago is we're going to spend a certain amount of surtax resources in the operating budget, and anything we collect over and above that goes into two other funds, the majority of which then is going to be spent on capital uses, other innovative one-time uses. And so what we have now seen, this was the second year, is in conjunction with the budget, the administration and then the House and the Senate using those surplus surtax resources on capital spending proposals and things like that. So that's what the governor's doing here. One of the concerns that we raised last year that unfortunately we continue to see is the governor's budget is using a portion of this, we calculated at about $300 million, really to support the operating budget, right? So there's about $150 million in the governor's surtax supplemental budget proposal that'll be used to fully fund sped circuit breaker, so special education reimbursements for school districts, and another $150 million that's being kind of redirected into ongoing early education costs. And so those are, I think from a fiscal standpoint, we understand why they're doing it, but that's what gets into that concern about the kind of long-term sustainability here. But in addition to that, you see a number of investments and a real focus, as I mentioned before, on the MBTA. I think that's consistent with what the administration put out last year, as well as some other smaller items as well. All right, so let's talk about healthcare. So healthcare, largest section of the budget. And this is a really interesting healthcare budget. So as I mentioned before, mass health spending in fiscal year 2026 grew by 10%. And as you might imagine, like that is just unsustainable, right? I don't care what revenue structure you have, it's not going to grow at 10%. And in order for us to support 10% mass health spending, it means that there's nothing available for anything else. And so one of the things that I know EOHHS, the Executive Office of Health and Human Services and the administration were focused on is like, you got to get these healthcare cost numbers down a little bit. They have done that. Well, so when you look at overall healthcare spending growth, it's between 1% and 3%, kind of depends on how we count that new healthcare transportation item I just meant, but certainly a lot less than 10%. I think the question is, what's assumed within that difference rate of growth? And we're still in the process of figuring that out. It always takes a couple weeks in kind of conversations with the administration to understand exactly what they're assuming. One of the ways we think they're getting that rate of spending growth down is they're really kind of prepaying some mass health costs that would otherwise be paid for in 27 in 26 and pushing some mass health costs that should be paid in 27 into 28. So what are often called these cash management techniques, where basically they're changing the timing of some payments to reduce the costs in 27. So as you imagine, that's not like a permanent solution, right? That's really kind of buying you time. And we're still not totally sure how much that's worth, but I think that's probably going to be a sizable element of how they reduce that ongoing spending cost. Now, to their credit, I think one of the things the administration has proposed is any mass health or healthcare savings initiative is challenging, right? It usually means you're either reducing rates to providers, or you're changing benefits, or you're changing how they work with agencies that provide support services, stuff that people have a lot of really strong opinions about. And I think they've learned in recent exercises that just kind of putting a proposal out there often means a lot of opposition, and then means it's not going to get done. And so what they have tried to do is create a series of these kind of smaller working groups in personal care attendance. That's what PCA stands for. Adult day health. So programs provided to some of their their elderly members and and senior members to provide them with services for caregivers during the day. Adult foster care. These are places where we've seen huge cost growth in recent years. And so trying to work with the community, work with other folks to identify some cost savings. Now, on the other end of the ledger, they are also explicitly proposing a reduction in adult dental services provided by MassHealth. That's something that I'm sure we'll hear a lot about. I think from the administration standpoint, they're looking at how our dental benefits compared to our peer states like New York, Connecticut, and California, and that we currently provide, I think, a much more expansive benefit. At the same time, as has happened before with this issue and others, they're going to hear a lot from folks who care deeply about this, right? So we'll see kind of how that goes. So there's a number of these kind of more specific proposals in there. Folks may have read about a proposal from the administration to limit access to GLP-1s. There's no language in the governor's budget related to do that. They may be doing that administratively, but that's certainly something they've talked about. So we'll learn more and publish more in the weeks ahead about the specific buildup for those mass health spending numbers. All right, so local aid. What do we see on local aid? This is the non-education portion of this. So unrestricted general government aid is the state's primary source of non-education local aid. We see the governor's budget increasing, it's called UGA, by 2.5%. For the last decade or so, UGA in most years has been tied to the assumed rate of tax revenue growth. It's a little higher this year, right? 2.5% versus 2.4, but kind of in that same ballpark. The Mass Municipal Association has been calling for kind of a rebasing of UGA, right, to argue that they've been shortchanged a little bit over the years. We don't see that in the administration's budget. We also don't see any change in the formula in how UGA is distributed. Pilot is payment in lieu of taxes for state-owned land, right? So the state is the biggest landowner. The state doesn't pay property taxes. It reimburses communities for some of the costs associated, and there's a lot of demand from communities, especially those with a lot of state-owned properties, to get reimbursed at greater levels. You see a small increase from the governor's budget, but really not much, about 2%. On the early education and care front, so we see an increase. Again, this is compared to the budget the governor signed last year of $182 million. That looks like a relatively sizable increase, but there's kind of less there than meets the eye. And the reason why I say that is, in last year's budget, there was a supplemental appropriation to really maintain some access and rate changes made in early education back 2 years ago. That's not reflected in the budget the governor signed. And so when you look at actually kind of where things are going to land in fiscal year 2026, it's much more of kind of a level funding budget from the governor this year than an expansion. And Victoria Bergeron on our team does fantastic work on early education. People should reach out to her directly. We don't anticipate any major access changes or really any rate increases in what the governor proposed in early education and care. And C3 grants, this is a big initiative the state had following from the pandemic. We see level funding of C3 grants at $475 million. In terms of how that surtax supplemental budget is being used for early education, we really see about the big piece of it is $150 million being used to recapitalize an early education trust fund that they then spend in the budget, right? So that's really the major thing you see there. So let's talk K-12 and Chapter 70. This is Megan Callahan on the team's real area of expertise. And so if folks have additional questions, she's definitely the person there. But as I mentioned before, we see year 6 of Student Opportunity Act implementation. After a pause in that first year of the pandemic, the new formula was implemented on time over a 6-year period. year-over-year increase is $242 million. That's a lot less than last year. That's a function of inflation. It's a function of student characteristics. But by our analysis, they are still fully funding SOA. And so you see kind of some of the component parts here. One thing that we get asked about a fair amount is it appropriate for them to be using surtax resources on the Student Opportunity Act? By our lights, I think the answer is yes. The Student Opportunity Act is the biggest policy expansion to the biggest education program in the state. I think that, for me, again, this is subjective, that fits under the header of a policy expansion in the education space, right? So yes, Chapter 70 is an existing program, but the fact that we launched a huge kind of rewrite of the formula that's dedicated to especially lower income communities, I do think that to me fits under the reasonableness test for the surtax, but certainly there are other folks who have different opinions on that. And then when we look at how that supplemental budget that the governor filed with her operating budget spends money on K-12, it's really about fully funding sped circuit breaker. Sped costs have increased dramatically in recent years. The concern for us here is that these surplus surtax resources are not likely to continue in future years, and so you're just building in a little bit of a fiscal cliff there. Higher education. So here's what we see in the governor's budget for higher education. You see that $2.2 billion versus $2.1 billion, so a relatively small increase. The big increase on the campus level appears to be annualization of recently ratified collective bargaining agreements. And so that's kind of a portion of what we see there in the governor's budget. In terms of the income that's surtax supplemental budget, there's much less for higher ed than there is for K-12 or early education. There's a little bit extra for financial aid, and they also have they've got $5 million. So they've got $10 million in total for these new spin-out initiatives they have, which are basically tech transfer programs for how the state can help higher ed institutions, other entities spin out commercializable technologies from research that happens, right? So it's a new initiative that we see in the governor's budget there. So Pablo Suarez and our team really leads our workforce efforts and has done a really good job, I think, creating an architecture to categorize how we think about workforce spending. This gives you our sense of categorization of this, and we do see increase in workforce spending over last year, GAA, not a huge increase. For folks who saw the governor's State of the Commonwealth, you saw some discussion of, increasing apprenticeship programs. In this year's budget, she is proposing a new community workforce partnership program to focus on training programs in communities with higher rates of poverty and things like that, but nothing new and major on the workforce front there. Andy Bagley on our team does a ton of work on transportation. So just to talk about this a little bit, the increase we see in the governor's budget versus last year's budget on transportation is really a function of administration trying to fully fund snow and ice costs. So one thing that if you listen to future MTF briefs on, say, the House budget or Senate budget, it tends to be more of a theme of legislative budget proposals is targeted underfunding of accounts, right? So funding an account at less than what is likely to actually be needed, with the idea that if we need to spend more, we'll spend more in the middle of the fiscal year. As you might imagine, that's not a great fiscal practice, right? Because you're kind of building in a deficit, but it is not an unheard of practice, I will say. And one of the classic areas where the House and Senate underfund the budget is snow and ice removal costs. They're basically hoping for an easy winter, as is the case in FY 2026, right? They probably are going to underfund those costs. And so that's really the big difference there on MassDOT as opposed to some major new transportation initiative. I think really what you see more of interest on the transportation front is in that governor's supplemental budget on the surtax, a big surge of funding to the MBTA. You see more supports for RTAs, a couple new initiatives related to MassDOT. So this is something that happy to follow up with folks further on the transportation front as well. Housing. So this is an issue where in recent years, we saw this huge demand of the state's emergency assistance program. It's really kind of incredible. So back in FY 24 into FY 2025, the state was spending over $1 billion a year on its emergency assistance program. We've seen obviously a major drop off in immigration. We've also seen some pretty significant policy changes on the state's emergency assistance program. Governor's budget is actually assuming a reduction in emergency assistance spending over last year's budget to less than $300 million, right? So that is about less than one third of what we were spending a few years ago. That's a function of demand, but it's also a function of policy. This is a place where I think you see more there was a story in the Globe the other day about folks who want to see a reopening of some of those policy changes. So this is something where there's a huge fiscal impact, I think, if either we get our projections wrong here or we start to make some major changes on the policy. They may be warranted, but just, that would have an impact on the budget's bottom line as well. So let me talk policy proposals, and then my hope is that some folks will have some questions or some things we can discuss before I wrap up here. But as folks likely know, every budget, whether it's the House, the Senate, governor, includes with it what are called outside sections. And outside sections can really do almost anything. And they're kind of policy riders that are attached to the spending side of the budget. Some have to do with spending. Some are clearly directly related to the state budget, but many are not. And so it's always an interesting exercise to look at kind of what you see as a theme in whether it's the governor, the House, or the Senate proposing. And I really want to thank our new mid-career fellow, Phil Lynch, for his work in helping us understand the governor's policy proposals and I think really enhance our work there. So the governor proposed 99 policy sections, and it's more of a hodgepodge this year, I would say. I think the major theme is probably fiscal, as opposed to 2 years ago. There was a huge focus on healthcare policy changes, things like that. You don't really see major policy initiatives in there. A couple exceptions that we'll touch on quickly. So on the tax front, last year, folks may recall, the governor proposed a number of tax changes in her budget. None of them ended up happening. This year, she didn't propose any tax changes. However, she did file effectively companion legislation a couple weeks ago that deals with how the state conforms to recent federal tax changes in the corporate code, basically delaying when we would align with the federal code by a year to 2 years, depending on the provision. That saves the state money. And we did an analysis kind of a framework a little while ago, earlier in January, that talks you through kind of how we think about at least conformity, the pros and cons. We'll have more analysis on this coming up. The other thing she proposes is the state has a pass-through entity tax to get around federal limitations on state and local tax deductibility. There's been a push from groups like ourselves and others in recent years to expand that to reflect the millionaire's tax. She has a proposal to do that, which actually the way she proposes it would generate additional revenue from the state. So we're taking a look at those things as well. So those things aren't in the budget, but they are closely related to the budget. In terms of healthcare, as I mentioned before, there is a section related to limiting dental services. There's a proposal to further extend a pilot program we run through our state's health exchange, the connector, to provide healthcare subsidies for folks at higher income levels that would not otherwise be eligible for mass health or state subsidies. And then there's a couple smaller initiatives that appear designed to maybe have some savings on substance abuse services and a couple other areas. I think the one thing, as I mentioned before, really is sections related to closing that budget gap, right? So I talked about that capital gains threshold proposal before. There's a proposal to redirect some interest earnings the state collects that would otherwise go to a bunch of different places back to the state budget. There's a proposal related to how we use the revenue generated from abandoned property when the state sells it, after if no one claims it. So there's a bunch of sections that relate to closing that budget gap. There is a really good one in here that we like that would require the state to do multi-year financial forecasting and to kind of stress test the budget for various economic circumstances and other things to see how well positioned we are to deal with shocks. That's something that other states, I think, are really leaders in compared to us. And I think it would be something that would really behoove the state to do, especially given the times we're living in right now. This slide I'm not going to talk about, but it just gives you a little bit more detail on that capital gains proposal I mentioned, what the governor is proposing to change. Again, we'll share these slides with everyone afterwards. And then in terms of other stuff in the budget, right? So there's a number of sections related to basically not allowing the state to automatically revoke your driver's license if you have unpaid fees or fines or property taxes or things like that, right? We've got proposals here related to speed cameras or cameras for speeding for law enforcement. Governor mentioned in her State of the Commonwealth simplifying the process for canceling subscriptions, right? So there's a section that would do that. there's a number of sections that relate to various ways that we license alcohol sales. So, beer gardens, things like that. This is a kind of a standard in budgets. We often see we have very Byzantine alcohol laws, and so you often see alcohol law changes in the state budget. So this year we see some of those, but nothing that really catches your attention is like, oh my gosh, what a huge initiative. Now, folks may have read that yesterday the governor had some major immigration and announcements related to how the state would or more appropriately would not cooperate with federal immigration efforts. Those aren't in the operating budget proposal. Those are in another supplemental budget proposal that the governor filed yesterday. All right, so big picture and what's next. Main takeaways. The big thing you're seeing in this budget is an exercise in producing a balanced budget with a $3.4 billion budget gap, right? Points 1 and 2 here are kind of the two sides of the same coin. You see a lot of efforts to close the budget gap, and you really don't see a lot of big swings in terms of new initiatives on either the spending or revenue front. I think this is a little bit of a let's try to manage through FY27 and see where things stand. And I think that's reflected in the policy proposal. I think on the concern front, the surtax is being asked to do a lot of heavy lifting. And at the end of the day, any fiscal proposal that is spending more than $3 billion in surtax funds should raise concerns for anyone, wherever you stand on the surtax as an ideological issue, because we haven't demonstrated that we're going to collect that much money. So you can do it once, but you can't do it twice. And so you want to make sure you're not building in too much risk there. In terms of the solutions that, as I mentioned before, kind of thinking through what the House and Senate are going to be faced with, not a lot of them really jump out as tough calls, aside from maybe that conformity bill, that bill to delay tax conformity. That, I think, will get a lot of careful scrutiny, not least of which because it would be a revenue bill moving through the process, right? So senators and reps would be able to propose whatever tax changes they want, and the House and Senate generally try to control how often they're going through exercises where you can get kitchen sink revenue proposals. That one, I think, will get careful scrutiny. The other ones, there may be some things they don't do, but it's not like last year where you saw a lot of administration proposals that probably just, I won't say were DOA, but were pretty early on treated with a lot of pushback about, hey, we're not going to do that. The other thing I would note is that there are a few solutions in here that really are predicated on us having an okay end to FY 2026. Now, there's always a heavy relationship between the current fiscal year and the next fiscal year. That's not new. But we've got 3 solutions here that I would identify, like paying mass health costs in 26 that would otherwise be owed in 27, some of the trust usage, how we're diverting capital gains, that really, they work as long as 26 ends fine. And to date, 26 has been okay, but I think we would all acknowledge we're in a time where who knows what the future holds. If April ends up being a bad month, I think that does throw into a little bit of a challenge some of the more notable solutions the governor has proposed. As I mentioned before, there are several other bills that are kind of not in the budget, but closely related to the budget. So we've talked about the tax conformity bill. We've talked about that innovation and capital sup. I mentioned the governor filed another supplemental budget yesterday with immigration and some other things. And then there's also the DRIVE Act, which the administration has proposed to use some surtax resources and some other resources to offset some federal cuts to higher education research, life science research. All right, and so to leave myself 5 minutes for questions, we'll end with this. So key questions that we're thinking about as this moves on to the House and Senate. So the House will take up their budget. You'll see a proposal from the House Ways and Means Committee the week before April vacation. They'll debate it the week after April vacation. Senate will go in May. So on the surtax and spending side, I think the proposal from the administration to use some surtax resources on health and human services transportation, it'll be interesting to see the reaction that gets, right? We're still learning more about that. We have not taken a position on that yet, but that's a change, right? So we'll see how folks feel about that. One of the frustrations I would say we had with last year's process was the level of coordination with how the budget worked with the funding in the innovation and capital sup was not that strong. And so you ended up with this kind of neither nor approach on transportation, where you didn't really accomplish the goals the administration and the House had set forward. You kind of ended in this middle of the road area where we're again faced with these gaps. I think from our standpoint, we'd hope to see better coordination there. I think the mass health will be a big question for everyone. What's the administration doing? What are the implications there? What's the pushback? On the revenue side, it's about tax conformity. What level of interest is there in the House and Senate? What do they change? What are some of the proposals that the administration is closing that gap that might get a more negative reaction? And the bottom line on both is the House and Senate are going to want to do some things that the administration didn't do. How do they support that? And generally speaking, you support it in one of two ways, right? You either spend less money in some areas of the budget or you propose new revenues in other areas of the budget. So what are those things they want to spend money on and how do they support that? I know that was a lot. Thank you all for joining. And my hope is there are a couple questions or comments. So let me pause for a second and folks raise your hand or just go off mute if there are questions.
We had one question in the chat from Greg. Feel free to raise your hand and come off mute if you'd like to ask it live. But Doug, if you have any thoughts on how the state would maybe respond to local governments that are also facing deficits due to healthcare costs, federal cuts, things like that.
Yeah, great question. So I think we've seen more and more coverage in recent years, and I was just at the MMA conference last week, actually, with Secretary Gorkowitz, talking about state and local fiscal pressures. The one reality check is the state has fiscal pressures too, right? And so irrespective of kind of the good, bad, and different, just know when you're looking at the governor's budget and the House and Senate budget this year, it is unlikely you're going to see significant new resources for new initiatives given other fiscal pressures and that federal uncertainty. Now, at the same time, I do think we are now getting to the end of the Student Opportunity Act implementation. What you've seen more and more discussion of is kind of the other side of the ledger on K-12 finance reform, which is who pays for it. What's the state local share? How do you determine that? I think you will see a much more invigorated discussion of that will ultimately lead to legislation there. My guess is you're not going to see final legislation this year, but that would be the next place. You'll obviously see a lot of discussion of Prop 2.5 as well. There've been a lot more Prop 2.5 votes recently, a lot more no votes. The only thing I would say on that is I think that while everyone is stretched for dollars, whether it's cities and towns, whether it's the state, or whether it's the people who voted on Prop 2.5 overrides. And so where any of those discussions would land, I think is much more uncertain. Other questions or comments? I see Tom Ryan went went on camera, so I've got to assume Tom has a question.
Oh, it's nice to be called out. Recognized. Thank you, Doug. I do want to say credit to your whole team for putting out this, the 31 pages and doing this so quickly because it helps us as other advocates to understand what you're saying. So thank you so much. It's a lot of good work. I did want to touch on just a question about the surtax, and I know it's in the larger report, but
Yeah.
I wonder if you think there are enough guardrails on this money because there is some effort that starts the idea of this can be used for expanding the definition of what is how you could use this. Particularly, there's a line item or a split to give money to HHS for transportation that didn't use this money last year. So that spirit could, I think, I'm concerned that may continue as it goes through the legislative process. I don't want to float ideas, but I think you can see that once you start using it in other parts of the state budget, it's hard to pull it back. So I wonder if you could talk about the guardrails and.
Yeah, and great question. And I'll answer that in two ways. So one, I think that the structures that were put in place, so the question itself, the actual ballot initiative does not have really any guardrails, right? And so in terms of someone could sue them, right? And I'm sure someone will at some point in time on something about what's education, what's transportation. But there was a Supreme Judicial Court case right before that went to the ballot that basically said money's fungible and people should be aware that this money can be used flexibly. And so in terms of what the question protects, I don't think it has a lot of protections. I do think that structure that was put in place in 2023 by the House Senate administration, I think gave some of the ideas for, is a strong structure. What you're seeing is kind of the intersection between that structure and fiscal pressures. And I think it is probably a time for us to have a continued conversation about how we make sure that, one, we're spending this in a way that allows for capital investment in addition to operating investment. And then what are some of the rubrics we're trying to use so you want to make sure there is a level of adaptability. You want to make sure that there's not some, these are the 4 line items or not. At the same time, I think it's in everyone's best interest for there to be a collective shared feeling that this is being used in the context in which it was meant. We haven't taken a position on those things yet by any means, but I think those questions are going to continue to come up. I'm not sure you can force that issue, right? Like it really is a question of kind of how folks, the culture that's been created. I think we started at a very strong place. And so I think that a further attention on that this year would be good. It is 11 now. So I just want to thank everyone for attending. And I will just say, as folks drop off, we so appreciate your participation in this. Would love to discuss whether it's membership, support, engagement with other MTF events. We'll share all these documents and materials with folks. But thanks again, and look forward to talking and seeing everyone soon. Thank you.